Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was February 10th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico. And this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. Let's begin today's document. Are you ready for some economics? Yes, today is going to be really economics focused, and if that made you groan, if you were like, ooh, I think I'm just going to hit that skip to the next episode button, keep in mind a couple things. First, if you're listening to this on February 10th, you are not going to be able to skip to the next episode because it isn't released yet, so just keep listening to this one. Second, even if you're listening to this at a time when it's quite easy to skip to the next episode, then I want you to just take a step back and think about when I say the word economics, how what I'm talking about can be expanded. And it's really easy to think about economics as just like the boring graphs about supply and demand and just money and budgets. But economics is about any kind of human decision making that takes value into account, and it's also about exchange and how people related to each other. So in every economic transaction or in every economic project, there are all kinds of larger values imbued, and you can see in the budgets and the numbers and the graphs the result of a lot of really interesting stuff that we don't normally associate with money and the stereotypical idea of economics. And that really is something that's a major focus of mine in this particular project that I'm looking at in this season of the Historian's Notebook. Because one of the major criticisms leveled at Joan and Violante is that they were financially irresponsible. And when all these modern historians, well, and also the early modern historians, or the historians that came within 100 years of their reign, when those writers are telling the story of Joan and Violante, they're almost all going to this reputation of theirs for being financially irresponsible. And then you don't get until the end of the 20th century with Donbratch Prince, you don't get a revision of that until a feminist scholar starts looking. And when you take a point of view, an historiographical angle on Joan and Violante and this question of financial responsibility, you start to see it in a lot of the writings that when people are talking about their management of money, they're also talking about gender. That it's coupled so frequently that Joan is seen as a, quote, effeminate king, and then was bad with money. It's really interesting to see how these are coupled, these ideas about Joan are coupled, and then also, especially in the older secondary literature on Joan and Violante, there's the criticism of Violante as not knowing her place and being too masculine and acting as a man and not being, womanly enough. And then, the finances were terrible. So I'm really curious about the story of the money and what was going on with economics at the time, because I really want to know whether it's accurate to say that Joan and Violante were significantly worse with money than others around their time, or maybe just before. And then I also want to know, even if they were, how was the discussion of financial matters imbued or affected or influenced by ideas about how a king wasn't really being the king, measuring up to expectations of what this exemplar of masculinity should be, and how a queen would not be measuring up to expectations of what a queen should be. And the economics is a place where you can see this happening. So when we go deep into the economics, we're building our background knowledge, our foundation for being able to understand some of the criticisms that come later. So that is just a huge historiographical context for today's document. Today's document is in Latin, but with the help of good old ChatGPT, I feel that I really understand what's happening in this Latin document. Hooray! I feel like it's been a rough go with understanding the Latin, but in this situation, I feel pretty confident that I know what's going on. Also, because ChatGPT was able to find some scholarly publications that have filled in the picture for me. And actually, I should clarify that last part. The second one that is very helpful, the second article that I'll mention today, I actually already had looked at a couple of years ago, but I'd forgotten about it. And ChatGPT flagged it in its search, and I was like, oh yeah, I remember that article. And then I went back, looked at my notes. I'm going to put a quote from that article on the webpage. All right, let's talk about this document. It's in the Commune Register. So it's not a secret seal document like yesterday's. It's one that is maybe at this level of just normal business of the crown, of the king. And Joan is sending a warning to the officials of Lleida, and he's warning them that if they don't pay up to a certain fellow named Berenguer de Almencario, then they're going to be in trouble. So what does the municipality of Lleida owe to Berenguer de Almencario? I should have said his name is Berenguer de Almencario. The answer to the question gets into this larger picture of the economics in the Crown of Aragon at this time. And something that I really want to emphasize is that this economy was highly financialized. What do I mean by saying highly financialized? When there's a lot of commerce, it means there's a lot of buying and selling in the marketplace and shipments and stuff like that. When we say that an economy is highly financialized, what that means is that there was a lot of investment, there were a lot of loan instruments, there was a lot of banking. And so when we look at the Crown of Aragon in the late 14th century, we're looking at a very extensive network of borrowing and lending money, of loans and debts and creditors. And it is gigantic. If you are interested in economic history already, and the stuff I was saying at the beginning of the episode, you were like, oh yeah, I'm on board. There's so much to study here, because the number of loan instruments, the number of arrangements of debtors and creditors, it's just astonishing. It really is something that makes a person question the difference between modern capitalism and what we're looking at in the 14th century, which most would call a pre-modern time. So what is the nature of the particular debt that the municipality of Lleida has? It's called a censal. And the censal is like what in our time we would call a bond, where the city has run out of money and they just got to borrow some, and then they pay it back and they pay interest on it. And Berenguer de Almencario was wealthy and could afford to loan Lleida some money. How do I know that Berenguer de Almencario was wealthy? He appears in a dissertation by Joaquin Sayers Clario, and he's listed in a couple different records as having lent out money to other municipalities. He seems to have been a very wealthy person in Valencia, which I'm not quite sure what to make of, because that's pretty far from Lleida, and maybe he just wasn't in Valencia the whole time and he was living someplace closer, or maybe he was really wealthy and just had loans, these censal loans, to a bunch of different municipalities. I'm not quite sure what to make of that Valencia connection. But here, this Latin letter is Joan writing to this municipality saying, as king, doing a little sourcing here, as king, I'm telling you that you need to pay this guy. He's let me know you haven't paid him, and you owe him quite a lot of money. So it seems like we're looking at a sum of, I think, well, it says 100, what does it say, 100, 300 pounds? It's the unit of currency is libris. So that's a lot of money. I'm not quite sure why we don't have 1,000 numerical. I just noticed this, that the unit, the number is like 100 of 300s. Anyway, it's a lot of money. And what Joan is saying is that if you, city of Lleida, don't pay up, then I am going to fine you, that you'll have to pay to me, 100 florins. So you better pay up. And so here what we have is the king advocating on behalf of a creditor to a city. And the article that gives some really great background context to this is one by 3 authors, actually, in a collection on pre-modern European finances. So Manuel Sanchez, Angel Selma Munoz and Antoni Furio in 2008 wrote in an English language, which has a native English speaker I'm really grateful for. They wrote a real great breakdown of the financial instruments that were utilized by cities in the 14th century. And it's available. They've generously made it available for free on the academia.edu website for, I can't remember which one of them. I'll put a link to it in the webpage for today's episode. So, cities often found themselves short of cash. And there were all kinds of different types of loans that they could take out. And the censal, which is mentioned here in Latin a couple times in this letter, sensualem is, I think, how you pronounce it in the Latin in this particular document. It appears a couple different times. I think, one that's sticking out to me is in the 5th line from the bottom. In the middle of that line, you can see it. Oh, it's also in the 4th line, 3rd word from the end. So these censals were a type of loan that we would call a bond. And yeah, you paid it back with interest, and you could get a cash infusion if you were a city that was running out of money. And so there were all kinds of loan instruments, and this was one of them. And the exact details of it, that granular level, you have to kind of dig a little bit deeper into that. But basically, they all had different loan terms, and like in duration and when the interest would accumulate, and its frequency of, what's the term for this? I can't remember, but the frequency of when that interest is accrued. All of that could vary, and so that is why we've got a bunch of different terms here. And then also levels of guarantee would affect loan instrument being categorized in one category versus another. The loans that Joan and Violante took a lot of heat for taking out are called mogubels, and hopefully I'll encounter a record of a mogubel sometime this year, and at that point I'll go into greater detail about the mogubels, but they were really usurious. I mean, the interest rates on these could be really out of control. There wasn't a lot of regulation about interest rates, and so you could charge someone a gigantic exploitative level of interest rate, and if they accepted that contract, they would be on the hook for paying that exorbitant amount of money as it compounded over time. There was what the authors of this article that I've just been talking about, there was a, quote, constant financial emergency on the part of municipalities and also on the part of the royal family, pretty much from the 1340s all the way until the end of the 14th century. Pere the Ceremonious, Joan's father, was a wrecking ball when it came to the financial networks of the Crown of Aragon. He at one point in 1381 just said, I'm not going to pay the loan back. You're just going to have to eat that. And he said that to one of the most prominent banks in Barcelona. And that bank, it collapsed, and it was like a financial crisis for the banking system of the Crown of Aragon. And what Joan and Violante inherit is the aftermath of a lot of that. So basically, there's a very intense financialized system that at the same time is rocked by certain scandals occasionally, and then also by bankruptcies. And as we look at who's taking out loans, which government entities, which individuals are taking out the loans, and then who is giving the loans, who are the creditors, we will start to see some very interesting things. And I will just put out one name for the moment for you to keep a lookout for when thinking about the economics of the Crown of Aragon in the late 14th century. And that is a Genoese fellow named Luchino Scarampi. And we've got a document that involves Luchino Scarampi coming up in a little while. All right, thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt cara compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job. Remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. But hey, over the course of this year, we're going to come back to economics, so maybe at that point it'll be less dissatisfying. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes. And listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.